There comes a precise moment when a man realizes he is standing before someone truly different. And that moment rarely has anything to do with what you say or what you do. It has everything to do with what he feels when he is near you, and why he cannot fully explain that feeling. Most women grow up believing that to be noticed, remembered, or leave a lasting impression on a man's mind, they must try harder. They believe they need to speak more, shine brighter, always be available, and constantly prove their worth. That belief is understandable because it is how many of us were taught to think about attention as something earned through visible effort. But what truly makes a woman unforgettable in a man's mind rarely comes from effort. It comes from somewhere much quieter and much more difficult to imitate. If you've ever felt someone looking at you differently, lingering in a conversation just a little longer, or lowering their emotional guard around you without you doing anything special to make it happen, you weren't imagining it. What you experienced has an explanation. It isn't magic. It isn't coincidence. It is a real psychological pattern. And today, you're going to understand exactly what it is, so you can stop doubting what you've already sensed. What a man notices when he feels there is something different about a woman is not her beauty, not her achievements, and not even her social skills. He notices the absence of something, the absence of a constant need for validation, the absence of that endless hunger to be reassured, to be approved of, to receive constant confirmation that she is enough. When that need becomes quiet or disappears altogether, something changes in the way she occupies space. And although most men cannot explain it in words, they recognize it instantly. Carl Jung described this as part of the process of individuation, the gradual construction of an inner center that no longer depends on the opinions or approval of others. Most people spend their lives ruled by what Jung called the persona, the social mask created to gain acceptance. Very few ever reach the deeper center of the self. But when a woman begins building that center, even partially, she no longer depends on the outside world to constantly remind her who she is. And that change becomes visible, even if no one can explain exactly why. This is the part I want you to understand, because everything else grows from here. A man is not attracted to the absence of need because she is cold or emotionally distant. He is attracted because, for the first time in a long time, he doesn't feel responsible for carrying another person's emotional state. He doesn't feel that every word he says could either destroy her mood or keep her happy. That freedom creates an unexpected sense of peace. Even if he never puts it into words, his mind and body recognize it as something rare, something safe, something restful. Something he naturally wants to return to. This is where many women completely misunderstand the idea. They think this calmness means pretending not to care. They believe they have to act indifferent to appear special. But this has nothing to do with pretending. True calm cannot be performed. It only exists when your emotional center no longer depends on another person's reactions. Let's talk about silence. Because silence is where this pattern becomes easiest to see. Most people cannot tolerate silence inside a conversation or a relationship. Silence feels like an empty space that must be filled. They assume it means something is wrong, so they talk too much. They ask unnecessary questions. They search constantly for reassurance. But a woman who has developed her inner world experiences silence differently. For her, silence is simply silence. It isn't evidence that love is fading. It isn't proof that something is broken. When a man is with a woman who can sit comfortably in silence, without anxiety, without nervous chatter, without trying to fill every second, something inside him relaxes. Because many of his previous relationships demanded constant attention, constant texting, constant conversation, constant reassurance. even when there was nothing meaningful left to say. Then suddenly he meets someone with whom silence doesn't feel like distance, it feels like companionship. And although that may sound like a small difference, psychologically, it is enormous, especially for someone who has spent years surrounded by emotional pressure. Perhaps you've noticed this yourself. Maybe your silence has made some people uncomfortable, while with someone else, that very same silence felt completely natural. You weren't imagining it. You were discovering who could truly meet your peace and who could only relate to the version of you that was constantly performing. Now let's talk about distance, because this is where the pattern becomes even clearer. Most people interpret distance as rejection. They see it as abandonment, a punishment, or proof that something is wrong in the relationship. That is why, the moment someone begins to pull away, the instinctive reaction is to chase them, to ask endless questions, to demand explanations, to search desperately for reassurance. Although this often looks like love, it is usually driven by something much deeper. Fear. The fear that distance confirms the painful belief that we were never enough. A woman who has done the work of facing that fear responds very differently. She doesn't pretend she doesn't care. She doesn't ignore what is happening. But she also doesn't lose herself simply because someone else needs space. She remains connected to herself, even when the relationship temporarily moves further away. Her sense of worth is no longer dependent on constant closeness. For a man, this is a completely different experience from what he has often known. Many of his previous relationships may have been filled with accusations the moment he needed time alone. Every moment of silence became suspicious. Every delay required an explanation. Every step back became a source of conflict. Then he meets someone who allows space without turning it into emotional warfare. Without realizing it, he experiences something he has rarely felt before: freedom. This helps explain why a man often remembers the woman who didn't chase him when he needed space more vividly than the one who was always available. It isn't because he values absence. It is because that calm absence revealed an emotional stability he had rarely encountered. And, without even intending to, his mind turns that experience into an internal reference point, something he quietly compares future relationships against. Perhaps this also explains something you felt yourself. Maybe you noticed that when you stopped chasing, when you stopped needing an immediate reply just to feel okay, people began treating you differently. That wasn't luck. And it wasn't manipulation. It was the natural result of your emotional stability no longer depending on someone else's reaction to another person's mind. That kind of stability feels trustworthy. It feels safe. It feels refreshing. Now let's move to another place where this pattern becomes impossible to ignore: conflict. Most people enter disagreements with their defenses already activated. They attack, they justify themselves, they shut down emotionally, or they collapse under the weight of the conversation. Although these reactions look different on the surface, they all come from the same place: the fear of being exposed as not enough, the fear of being wrong in a way that feels impossible to repair. A woman who has developed greater emotional awareness approaches conflict differently. She can disagree without needing to win. She can hear criticism without allowing it to destroy her entire sense of self. This doesn't mean criticism doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean she never feels disappointed. It simply means her identity isn't built entirely on another person's approval. Because of that, disagreements stop feeling like threats to her existence. For a man, encountering this kind of emotional maturity can be deeply surprising. Many of his previous experiences may have ended in endless blame, days of silent punishment, or emotional explosions that left both people exhausted. Then suddenly he meets someone capable of disagreement without distraction. Someone who doesn't disappear and doesn't try to destroy him either. Without fully understanding why, he recognizes that he is standing before a different kind of emotional maturity. And that recognition creates a level of respect that often grows much deeper than simple attraction. This is another point where many people misunderstand what it means to be different. They assume emotional maturity means avoiding conflict altogether, always agreeing, always keeping the peace, never expressing disagreement. But that isn't maturity. Real maturity is being able to disagree without making victory necessary for your self-worth. That small difference changes the emotional experience of the relationship completely. Now let's go even deeper to fear itself. Because beneath silence, distance, and conflict, there is one psychological force connecting them all: our relationship with fear. Most people don't actually manage their fear. They project it. When they fear abandonment, they become controlling. When they fear they aren't enough, they become demanding, or they withdraw completely to avoid being hurt. Fear that remains unconscious quietly takes control of behavior. A woman who begins recognizing her fears instead of automatically projecting them behaves in a way that naturally feels more secure to a man, even if she still experiences fear herself, because the goal is not to eliminate fear. Fear is part of being human. The real difference is that fear no longer controls every decision automatically. There is now a pause, a small inner space, between feeling fear and acting from it. That space is exactly what emotional maturity looks like, even if nobody calls it by that name. If you've ever felt afraid inside a relationship, yet managed not to react impulsively, know this: that wasn't weakness, and it wasn't emotional detachment. It may have been one of the strongest and quietest acts of emotional courage a person can make. And it is precisely the kind of strength that quietly sets someone apart in the eyes of another. This brings us to something almost no one explains clearly: the wounds we carry from the past. Every one of us enters a relationship with a history, with experiences that have left their mark, with emotional patterns shaped by childhood, past relationships, disappointments, and moments that taught us how to protect ourselves. The difference is not between those who have wounds and those who don't. Everyone carries them. The real difference lies in how aware we become of those wounds and how willing we are to take responsibility for them instead of placing their weight on someone else. A woman who begins to understand her own emotional scars gradually stops repeating the patterns that quietly damage relationships. She no longer feels the need to constantly test another person's love. She becomes less likely to interpret every ambiguous signal as rejection. She no longer withdraws first simply to avoid the possibility of being hurt later. As these automatic reactions begin to fade, the relationship itself changes. A man who is close to that transformation may not understand the psychology behind it, but he feels its effects. There are fewer emotional tests, fewer accusations, less pressure to constantly prove that he isn't going to leave. That doesn't mean she has become perfect. It doesn't mean she no longer has insecurities. It simply means she has begun facing those insecurities instead of allowing them to control every interaction. That single decision to face your own wounds instead of projecting them onto someone else is one of the most powerful transformations any human being can experience. But there's another truth that deserves to be spoken. Recognizing your wounds is not the same as making them the center of every conversation. Some people mistake emotional growth for constantly talking about their trauma, their pain, their past, hoping another person will understand it or heal it. Ironically, that often creates emotional pressure that many relationships struggle to carry. Real healing is not measured by how often you speak about your pain. It is measured by how little your pain automatically decides your behavior. Now let's return to something we mentioned at the very beginning: the absence of the need for external validation. This doesn't appear overnight. No one is born with it. It is the result of a long inner journey, a journey in which a person gradually begins to trust their own opinion of themselves, instead of relying entirely on the opinions of others. Although this sounds abstract, it changes everyday behavior in remarkably practical ways. Imagine a woman who doesn't need every text message answered immediately in order to feel emotionally secure. Her behavior becomes completely different. She doesn't stare anxiously at her phone every few minutes. She doesn't interpret every delay as rejection. She doesn't create frightening stories in her mind simply because someone took longer than expected to reply. That quiet sense of security may appear insignificant, but another person experiences it as emotional stability, and that stability stands out dramatically in a world where anxiety often dominates relationships. The same is true in many other areas. A woman who doesn't constantly need compliments to feel beautiful, who doesn't need endless reassurance to trust her own decisions, who doesn't depend on someone else's approval to believe in herself, is no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of seeking validation. This doesn't mean she stops caring about the opinions of those she loves. It simply means those opinions are no longer the foundation of her self-worth. That subtle shift changes everything, and it is exactly the kind of difference a man senses, even if he has no words to explain it. This is where many people make another mistake. They believe confidence can simply be acted out. For a while, perhaps it can, but eventually the body reveals the truth. Our behavior exposes the difference between genuine inner security and carefully performed confidence. Someone pretending not to seek validation often sends mixed signals. Outwardly, they appear calm. Internally, they are analyzing every message, every expression, every silence. Sooner or later, those contradictions become visible. Real confidence cannot be imitated forever. It grows from the inner work that supports it. That leads us to another essential quality: consistency. A man doesn't recognize this difference from one impressive moment. He recognizes it over time. Anyone can appear confident during a first date. Anyone can remain calm for a single conversation. But what truly convinces another person that someone is different is consistency. Remaining emotionally grounded through silence, distance, conflict, and uncertainty. Especially when life becomes difficult, this consistency is perhaps the hardest part of all, because it requires choosing awareness again and again. Even when old habits feel easier, the urge to chase, the urge to explode during conflict, the urge to seek reassurance every time insecurity appears. Real growth isn't the absence of those temptations. It is recognizing them and choosing a different response more often than before. If you sometimes find yourself falling back into old emotional patterns despite all your efforts, don't see that as failure. It doesn't disqualify you. It simply means you're still in the process. And every real process includes setbacks. Perfection has never been the goal. Direct is what matters. The direction in which your life is moving. There is one more truth that deserves your attention. This kind of emotional stability does not come from feeling less. It doesn't come from becoming cold. It doesn't come from suppressing your emotions or pretending that nothing affects you. It comes from learning how to feel deeply without allowing every emotion to take control of your behavior. A woman who has done this inner work still feels sadness. She still experiences fear. She still feels jealousy, disappointment, and uncertainty. The difference is that she chooses how to express those emotions instead of allowing the emotions to speak before wisdom has a chance to respond. This ability to feel without becoming overwhelmed is one of the most underrated qualities in any relationship. People often encourage us to express our feelings, and that advice has value. But very few people talk about the difference between expressing an emotion consciously and simply unloading it impulsively. Although the difference appears small, it completely changes the emotional quality of a relationship. Let's return to something we mentioned earlier. When a man encounters a woman who is capable of feeling deeply without automatically placing the weight of those emotions on him, he experiences something rare. He feels emotionally safe. Not because she never struggles, but because he no longer feels responsible for preventing emotional explosions every time something goes wrong. Without realizing it, that sense of emotional safety becomes one of the strongest reasons he wants to stay. Now let's return to the heart of everything we've discussed. None of this means a woman should silence her needs. It doesn't mean she should ignore her feelings, and it certainly doesn't mean she should become some perfect image of endless calm. That would simply become another mask, another performance designed to gain approval, which is the exact opposite of genuine emotional growth. The real difference is not the absence of needs. It is the ability to express those needs without allowing another person's response to determine your entire sense of worth. A woman can honestly say she needs better communication. She can admit that certain behavior hurts her. She can express what she hopes for in a relationship. And she can do all of that without turning those needs into desperate ultimatums driven by fear. This calm, honest form of communication is another quality a man notices. Even if he cannot explain why it feels so different, it also explains why some women establish healthy boundaries without damaging the relationship, while others, despite having similar intentions, unintentionally create distance and conflict. The difference is rarely the boundary itself. The difference is the emotional place from which that boundary is expressed. Is it coming from fear or from genuine self-respect? At this point, I want you to think about yourself. You have probably already recognized some of these qualities within you. Even if you never had the words to describe them before, your ability to remain comfortable in silence, your willingness to allow healthy space, your capacity to disagree without trying to destroy the other person. These are exactly the qualities that quietly stand out. These are the traits that make someone feel different. And if you realize that many of these patterns still don't describe you, if you notice that fear still influences your reactions more often than you'd like, that is not failure. It is simply an honest reflection of where you are in your journey. The fact that you are willing to understand these patterns already places you on a path that many people never choose to walk. Most people spend their lives repeating unconscious behaviors. Few ever pause long enough to examine them. Before we finish, let's leave with one simple truth. What a man recognizes as different in a woman is not a trick. It is not a dating strategy. It is not a carefully practiced personality designed to attract attention. It is the visible result of invisible inner work. Less dependence on external validation. Greater comfort with silence. The ability to respect distance without panic, the courage to disagree without needing to win, a deeper awareness of personal fears and emotional wounds, and the strength to experience powerful emotions without becoming controlled by them. From this moment forward, whenever you notice someone looking at you differently, whenever you feel another person relax in your presence without fully understanding why, whenever someone continues returning to you even though you never chased them, you will understand what is really happening. It isn't luck. It isn't coincidence. It is the natural consequence of a person who has built an inner center strong enough that it no longer depends entirely on the approval of others. Thank you for spending these moments with me and staying until the very end of this reflection. If today's message resonated with you, if you recognized yourself or someone close to you in these patterns, be sure to subscribe to the channel. In the coming videos, we'll continue exploring these fascinating insights through the lens of Jungian psychology, helping you understand with clarity what you may have felt for years but never been able to explain. In our next video, we'll explore a question that connects directly to everything we've discussed today. What really happens inside a man's mind during the first few seconds when he silently decides whether he wants to stay or walk away forever? Until then, remember this. You didn't become unforgettable because you changed yourself to earn someone's love. You became unforgettable the moment your inner self no longer needed someone else's approval to feel complete.